The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neat, well-tended porch where Mrs. Eleanor Washington gently rocked in her favorite chair, a glass of sweet tea perspiring on the small table beside her. At 72, she had earned every one of her peaceful moments on this porch, having spent over 3 decades shaping young minds as a school teacher in this very neighborhood. The street was quiet, as it usually was at this hour. Children would soon be returning from their after-school activities, and the familiar sounds of life would fill the air again. Mrs. Washington smiled, remembering how she used to watch her own son playing on this same sidewalk, his laughter echoing through the years. Her reverie was interrupted by the sound of a police cruiser slowly rolling down the street. She didn't think much of it at first. Police occasionally patrolled the area, but something about the way the car crept along made her sit up straighter in her chair. The vehicle came to a stop directly in front of her house, and 2 officers stepped out, their expressions set in stern lines that made her heart skip a beat. "Ma'am," the taller officer called out, his hand resting casually on his belt as he approached the front gate. "We've received a report of a suspicious person in this area." His partner, a shorter officer with crew-cut hair, was already speaking into his radio, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Washington. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she'd experienced countless times over her long life when confronted with such situations. But decades of handling difficult parents' meetings and maintaining order in classrooms had taught her how to keep her voice steady. "Officers, I live here. This is my home." The taller officer pushed open the gate without asking permission, the hinges creaking in protest. "We'll need to see some identification." His tone wasn't exactly hostile, but it carried an edge that made it clear this wasn't a request. Mrs. Washington's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, hanging on the coat rack just inside the screen door. "Of course, officer. Though I must say, I've lived here for 40 years. My name is Eleanor Washington, and I taught at Springfield Elementary until I retired 5 years ago." The shorter officer had moved to the bottom of the porch steps now, his stance widening as if preparing for something. "Ma'am, please keep your hands where we can see them and move slowly." Through the window behind her, family photos were clearly visible, graduation pictures, holiday celebrations, 4 decades of memories proving this was her home. She pointed to them, her voice taking on the patient tone she used with countless difficult students. "Officers, if you'll just look through that window, you'll see." "Ma'am, we need you to focus on providing your identification, not directing us to look elsewhere," the taller officer interrupted, taking a step onto her porch. The wooden boards creaked under his heavy boots, and Mrs. Washington felt her space being invaded, a sanctuary being breached. The situation was escalating, and she could feel it slipping out of her control. More concerning was how the officers seemed to be positioning themselves, one on the porch now, the other maintaining what they probably called a tactical position below. She'd seen this before, had heard about it happening to others, but never imagined it would happen on her own porch. Across the street, Mrs. Chen from number 403 had come out to water her plants, but Mrs. Washington could tell she wasn't really focusing on her gardening. Young Mr. Rodriguez from next door had stepped out onto his driveway, phone in hand, subtly recording the scene unfolding on her porch. They were witnesses, and their presence provided both comfort and shame, comfort in not being alone, shame that they had to see her treated this way. The identification card was right there in her purse, but now she felt uncertain about reaching for it. Years of teaching had trained her to recognize when a situation was about to spiral, and every instinct was telling her this was one of those moments. She needed help, and thankfully she knew exactly who to call. Her son, a respected attorney who specialized in civil rights cases, was only 15 minutes away. He'd given her strict instructions about situations like this, though they'd both hoped she'd never need to use them. As the officers continued their increasingly aggressive questioning, she kept her hands visible and her voice calm, all while silently praying her neighbors had already contacted her son. All she had to do was hold on to her dignity and composure for a few more minutes. The teacher's lounge had taught her more about patience than any classroom ever could, and right now, she drew on every ounce of that experience. Inside, her heart was racing, but outwardly, she maintained the same steady presence that had commanded respect from generations of students. The sounds of the neighborhood seemed to have fallen away. leaving only the heavy breathing of the officers, the creak of her porch boards, and the distant sound of traffic. She was acutely aware of every movement, every shift in the officer's stance, every passing second that brought her closer to her son's arrival. Would you like me to continue with part 2 of the expanded story? I can maintain this engaging, detailed narrative style while building tension and developing the situation further. The tension on Mrs. Washington's porch continued to build as more neighbors emerged from their homes. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead, not just from the heat, but from the stress of the situation. The taller officer had now moved even closer, his shadow falling across her rocking chair like a dark curtain. "Listen here," the officer said, his voice growing louder with each word. "We've had reports of break-ins in this area. If you really live here, proving it should be no problem." His hand remained near his belt, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the growing crowd of onlookers. Mrs. Washington clutched the armrests of her rocking chair, her knuckles turning white. 40 years of teaching had taught her to recognize when someone was trying to provoke a reaction. She'd dealt with angry parents, rebellious teenagers, and difficult administrators, but this was different. This was happening at her own home, a sanctuary. The shorter officer had pulled out his notepad and was writing something down, his pen scratching against the paper with unnecessary force. "Can you explain why a neighbor would report suspicious activity if you've lived here so long?" His tone dripped with skepticism, as if her decades of residence meant nothing. From across the street, Mrs. Chen had abandoned all pretense of watering her plants. She was now standing at her mailbox, phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly. 2 houses down, the Thompsons had come out onto their porch, their faces etched with concern. The Rodriguez family's teenager was still recording, his young face serious with the understanding that what he was witnessing wasn't right. "Officers," Mrs. Washington began again, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I have taught many of this neighborhood's children. That young man recording right now, I taught his older sister, the woman on the phone. Her twins were in my class just before I retired. This is my community." But her words seemed to bounce off the officers like rain on a window pane. The taller one took another step forward, his boot landing on the hand-crocheted welcome mat her church group had made for her last Christmas. "Ma'am, if you continue to be uncooperative." A car alarm chirped in the distance, interrupting his threat. Mrs. Washington noticed several of her neighbors straightening up, their faces showing relief. They could hear what she heard, the distinctive sound of her son's car approaching. She'd recognized that engine anywhere. It was the same sound that had greeted her every Sunday for their weekly family dinners. The shorter officer must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere because he turned toward the street, his stance becoming more rigid. The crowd of neighbors had grown to about a dozen people now, all watching intently as a black SUV came speeding around the corner, its tires gripping the asphalt with urgency. Mrs. Washington felt her shoulders relax slightly. Her son had always been her protector, even when he was just a little boy. She remembered how he'd stand up to playground bullies despite being smaller than them, how he'd developed a strong sense of justice early on. It was what had driven him to become an attorney, specializing in cases just like this one. The SUV came to a precise stop at the curb, and out stepped her son in his crisp suit, his briefcase in one hand and his phone already recording in the other. His face was a mask of professional calm, but Mrs. Washington could see the anger flickering in his eyes, the same expression he'd had as a child when someone was being treated unfairly. The officer's attention was now split between Mrs. Washington and her approaching son. The energy on the porch shifted palpably, like the air before a storm. Her son's footsteps on the walkway were measured and deliberate, each step carrying the weight of his legal expertise and personal indignation. "Good afternoon, officers," he called out, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could only come from years of courthouse experience. "I'm Mrs. Washington's son, and I'm also an attorney. Would you mind explaining why you're harassing my mother on her own property?" The taller officer's hand moved away from his belt for the first time since arriving, and he took a small step back. The shorter one closed his notepad, tucking it into his pocket with less confidence than he'd shown when taking it out. They could feel the tables turning, sense the shift in power dynamics. Mrs. Washington watched as her son climbed the porch steps, positioning himself slightly in front of her chair. She noticed how he made sure to keep his movements slow and deliberate, even as his voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the afternoon heat. The neighbors had inched closer, their phones still recording, providing a silent chorus of witnesses to what was unfolding. Would you like me to continue with part 3 of the story? I can maintain this engaging narrative while developing the confrontation's resolution and its impact on the community. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Mrs. Washington's son stood firmly on the porch, his presence commanding attention from everyone present. The setting sun cast long shadows across the lawn, where neighbors had gathered in silent support, their phones still raised and recording. Let me be clear about what I'm observing, her son began, his voice carrying the weight of countless courtroom battles. I see 2 officers harassing an elderly woman on her private property. A woman who, I might add, has her name on the mailbox you walked past, her photos visible through that window, and decades of history in this neighborhood. The taller officer shifted his weight, his earlier confidence wavering. Sir, we were responding to a suspicious person call. A suspicious person call, her son repeated, each word measured and precise. About a 72-year-old retired teacher sitting on her own porch in broad daylight. Would you mind sharing which neighbor made this call? His hand moved smoothly to his briefcase, unclicking the latches with practiced ease. The shorter officer glanced at his partner, their earlier bravado diminishing under the attorney's steady gaze. That information is confidential. Actually, Mrs. Washington's son interrupted, pulling out a small notebook. Under Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act, we have the right to know the basis for this interaction, including the source of the complaint. I'm particularly interested in understanding how this situation escalated to 2 officers intimidating my mother without probable cause. Mrs. Washington watched with quiet pride as her son continued. She remembered all those nights he'd spent studying at their kitchen table, determined to understand every law, every precedent that could help protect people in situations exactly like this one. The neighbors had grown silent, but their presence spoke volumes. Mrs. Chen was still on her phone, now apparently talking to someone at the police station. The Rodriguez family had moved closer, their teenage son's hand steady as he continued recording. Even old Mr. Peterson, who rarely left his house, stood on his front lawn in quiet solidarity. Furthermore, as some continued, I've been recording since I arrived, and I can see at least 10 other witnesses doing the same. Your body cameras should also provide interesting footage of how you approached and escalated this situation. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Now, would either of you care to explain why you felt it necessary to step onto my mother's private property without permission or probable cause? The officers exchanged glances, their earlier aggression replaced by uncertainty. The taller one cleared his throat. We were just following protocol. Protocol? Her son's eyebrow raised slightly. Please cite the specific protocol that requires harassing a homeowner on their own property without first verifying their residence through readily available means, like perhaps the name on the mailbox, or the multiple neighbors who could have confirmed her identity. Mrs. Washington noticed how the younger officer's hand had started fidgeting with his notepad. She'd seen that same nervous gesture countless times in her classroom when students realized they'd made a serious mistake. The older officer's stance had changed too, his shoulders no longer squared for confrontation but slightly hunched, as if trying to make himself smaller. I would strongly suggest, her son continued, his voice now carrying a tone that commanded immediate action, that you both return to your vehicle and contact your supervisor. I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing tomorrow morning, and I expect a full investigation into this incident. The neighbors murmured in approval, and Mrs. Washington could see heads nodding in her peripheral vision. Young Mr. Rodriguez gave a subtle thumbs up, his phone still recording steadily. Mrs. Chen had finally ended her call and was now walking across the street, her face set with determination. The officer's retreat was almost mechanical, a carefully choreographed backward step, followed by a measured turn toward their patrol car. The taller one paused briefly, as if considering whether to say something more, but thought better of it under the collective gaze of the community. As they walked back to their vehicle, Mrs. Washington's son turned to face her, his professional demeanor softening as he knelt beside her chair. "Are you okay, Mom?" he asked quietly, genuine concern replacing his courtroom voice. The simple question, so full of love and worry, nearly brought tears to her eyes. She reached out and patted his hand, the same way she used to when he was a little boy coming home with scraped knees. "I'm fine, baby," she assured him, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just tired of having to prove I belong in my own home." The police cruiser pulled away from the curb, but nobody moved. It was as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to make sure the moment had truly passed. Mrs. Washington looked around at all the faces, some familiar, some newer to the area, and felt a complex mix of emotions: gratitude for their support, sadness that it was needed, and determination to ensure this incident led to meaningful change. As the police car disappeared around the corner, the neighborhood seemed to exhale collectively. One by one, Mrs. Washington's neighbors began making their way across their lawns toward her porch. Mrs. Chen arrived first, clutching her phone and looking both concerned and determined. "I called the police station," she announced, her voice carrying traces of anger mixed with relief. "I spoke to the sergeant on duty. He's already asking for copies of our recordings." She turned to Mrs. Washington's son, her expression serious. "I told them you're a civil rights attorney. They seemed very interested in that detail." The young Rodriguez boy, still holding his phone, stepped forward. "Mrs. Washington, I recorded everything from the moment they stepped onto your property. My sister's going to be so upset when she hears about this. You were her favorite teacher." His parents stood behind him, nodding in agreement. Mrs. Washington felt overwhelmed by the show of support, but it was the kind of overwhelming feeling that wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Her son remained close, his protective presence a comfort she'd relied on for years. He was already in what she called his lawyer mode, taking down neighbors' contact information and discussing the importance of preserving their video evidence. Old Mr. Peterson, who had finally made his way up to the porch, leaned on his cane and spoke with a voice rough with emotion. "Been your neighbor for 30 years, Eleanor. Never thought I'd see something like this in our neighborhood. Times are supposed to be changing, but some things." He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. The crowd on her lawn had grown, with more neighbors arriving as word spread through the community's group chat. Someone had brought over folding chairs, and another neighbor returned with a tray of cold lemonade. What had started as a frightening confrontation was transforming into an impromptu neighborhood gathering. Mrs. Washington's son addressed the assembled group, his voice carrying across the front yard. "What happened today isn't just about my mother. It's about every person who's ever felt unwelcome or unsafe in their own neighborhood. But look around. This is what community looks like. This is how we protect each other." The Thompsons' youngest daughter, who had just started teaching herself, raised her hand as if she was still in class. "Mrs. Washington, would you and your son be willing to come speak to my students about this? They need to understand these things still happen, but also how communities can stand together." Mrs. Washington felt tears welling up in her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd held back earlier. These were tears of gratitude, of hope, of seeing something beautiful emerge from an ugly situation. Her son squeezed her shoulder gently, understanding without words. As the evening progressed, plans began to take shape. Mrs. Chen, who worked in local government, was already talking about organizing a community meeting with the police department. The Rodriguez family offered to help set up a neighborhood watch program, not to report suspicious persons, but to ensure everyone's safety and belonging. Young couples who had recently moved into the area listened intently as older residents shared stories of how the neighborhood had changed over the decades, both the progress made and the challenges that remained. Children played on the lawn while their parents exchanged phone numbers and made plans for future gatherings. Mrs. Washington's son took a moment to sit beside her, both of them watching the scene unfold. "You know, Mom," he said softly, "sometimes it takes something bad to bring out the best in people. Look at what you've built here, not just a home, but a community that stands together." She smiled, remembering all the years of block parties, of helping neighbors with their gardens, of teaching their children, of being part of the fabric of this place. "Maybe that's the lesson here," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "When they tried to make me feel like I didn't belong, the whole neighborhood showed up to say otherwise." The next morning dawned with a different energy in the neighborhood. Mrs. Washington woke up early, as she always did, but today her porch was already occupied. Several neighbors had gathered with fresh coffee and breakfast, determined to show their continued support. Her son had stayed overnight, sleeping on the couch just like he used to during his law school days. The phone had been ringing since sunrise. First, it was the local news station, somehow having caught wind of the incident. Then came calls from her church members, former students, and even the superintendent she'd worked under before retiring. Each call carried the same message: "We're here for you, Mrs. Washington." Her son emerged from the house, already dressed in his suit, his phone pressed to his ear. She could tell from his expression that things were moving quickly. "Yes, Captain," he was saying, his voice firm but professional. "We appreciate your prompt attention to this matter, but we're looking for more than just an apology." Mrs. Chen arrived with fresh pastries from her daughter's bakery, setting them on the porch table that had become a kind of command center. She'd taken the day off work to help coordinate the community's response. Her government experience was proving invaluable as they navigated the bureaucracy of filing formal complaints. "The police captain wants to meet with us today," her son announced, finally ending his call. "They're taking this seriously, especially after seeing all the video evidence." He turned to the young Rodriguez boy, who was back with his parents. "Your footage was particularly helpful. You caught everything from the beginning." The morning grew warmer, but nobody moved from their posts. The neighborhood had transformed into a kind of united front, with people taking shifts to ensure Mrs. Washington wasn't alone. Even those who had to go to work stopped by briefly, promising to return later. Around midday, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped the police captain, along with what appeared to be the department's community relations officer. Unlike yesterday's aggressive approach, they waited respectfully at the gate until invited up. "Mrs. Washington," the captain began, removing his hat, "I want to personally apologize for the inexcusable behavior of our officers yesterday." His voice carried genuine regret, but Mrs. Washington's son stepped forward before he could continue. "Captain, while we appreciate your apology, we're more interested in hearing about concrete changes. How will you ensure this doesn't happen to someone else who might not have a lawyer in the family or a community ready to rally around them?" The community relations officer opened her notebook, her expression earnest. "We've already begun drafting new protocols for responding to suspicious person calls, but we'd like your input, all of you." She looked around at the gathered neighbors. "This neighborhood's response shows us what community policing should look like." Mrs. Chen spoke up from her spot on the porch. "We need regular meetings between officers and residents, not just when something goes wrong, but to build relationships, to understand each other." Several neighbors nodded in agreement. The young teaching Thompson stepped forward. "And we need officers to visit our schools, not to intimidate, but to learn from our children, to see our community through their eyes." Her voice carried the passion of someone who understood the power of education to create change. As the discussion continued, more neighbors arrived. Some shared their own stories of feeling profiled or unwelcome. Others offered suggestions for improvement, everything from cultural sensitivity training to community advisory boards. The captain took notes, looking increasingly thoughtful. Mrs. Washington watched it all from her rocking chair, her son standing protectively nearby. She saw how her front porch had become more than just her personal sanctuary. It was now a symbol of community resistance and unity. The very place where she'd been made to feel unwelcome was transforming into a center for positive change. The Rodriguez family's grandmother, who rarely spoke at community gatherings, stood up slowly. "When I first moved here 30 years ago, nobody would have stood up like this. We suffered in silence. But look at us now, all of us together, making things better for the next generation." Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Washington's front porch had become more than just a gathering place. It had transformed into a symbol of community strength and change. Every evening, different neighbors would stop by, some bringing food, others just coming to chat and check on her. But more importantly, they came to discuss the progress they were making. Her son had been true to his word about following through with formal complaints, but he'd also worked with the police department to develop new training programs. Today, he sat on the porch with his mother, sharing the latest developments. "The two officers from that day," he began, sipping the fresh lemonade Mrs. Chen had brought over. "They're both going through extensive retraining, but here's the interesting part. They've asked to meet with you, Mom. Not for any official reason, but because they want to understand the impact of their actions." Mrs. Washington rocked gently in her chair, considering this news. The past few weeks had taught her that change wasn't just about punishment, it was about growth and understanding. Maybe that's what they need, she said thoughtfully. To sit on this porch and see things from a different perspective. The neighborhood had changed too. What started as a response to one incident had sparked a larger movement. The young Rodriguez boy, inspired by the events, had started a social media campaign documenting positive interactions between the community and local law enforcement. His videos of joint community police initiatives were gaining attention beyond their neighborhood. Mrs. Chen's daughter had turned a bakery into a meeting spot where officers and residents could have coffee together, sharing stories and building understanding. The simple act of breaking bread together was breaking down barriers that had stood for generations. The Thompson girls' classroom had become a model for other schools in the district. She developed a program where students and officers worked together on community projects, learning to see each other as people first, not just uniforms or statistics. Even old Mr. Peterson, who'd lived through decades of distrust, had started sharing his stories with younger officers during their community meetings. It's not about dwelling on the past, he'd say, but about understanding how we got here and where we need to go. One evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, Mrs. Washington hosted a special gathering on her porch. The two officers from that day were there, along with the police captain and several community members. The atmosphere was different now, tense at first, but softening as stories were shared. The taller officer spoke first, his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been there before. Mrs. Washington, I've spent weeks thinking about how I approached your porch that day. I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as a call to respond to. I forgot that behind every call, there's a human being. His partner nodded, adding, We've been learning about the history of this neighborhood, about the people who built it. Your students, your neighbors, they've helped us understand what community policing should really look like. Mrs. Washington listened, noting how her son sat quietly beside her, no longer needing to be her protector in this moment. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on difficult topics, but always returning to the theme of growth and understanding. The young Rodriguez boy was there too, still with his camera, but now documenting something very different from that first day. Instead of recording confrontation, he was capturing reconciliation, the kind of moment that could teach future generations about the power of community and the possibility of change. As evening turned to night, Mrs. Washington looked around her porch at the faces illuminated by the soft porch light, faces of different ages, backgrounds, and positions in the community, all brought together by one incident that could have torn them apart, but instead had knit them closer together. 1 year had passed since that fateful afternoon on Mrs. Washington's porch. The neighborhood had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. Today, they were celebrating the first anniversary of what locals now called the porch movement, a name that made Mrs. Washington chuckle every time she heard it. Her front porch, once the site of confrontation, had become the heart of their community's transformation. On this sunny afternoon, it was decorated with balloons and streamers, while tables laden with potluck dishes stretched across her front lawn. People from all walks of life mingled together: residents, police officers, city officials, and even reporters from the local news station. Her son stood at the makeshift podium they'd set up, addressing the gathered crowd. A year ago, we faced a moment that could have divided us. Instead, it united us. Look around, this is what real community looks like. He gestured to the changes their neighborhood had pioneered. The police department had completely revamped its training program. New officers now spent time in the community before ever putting on a uniform, getting to know the people they'd be serving. The two officers from that day had become advocates for change within the department, sharing their story at training sessions. Mrs. Washington's role had evolved too. She'd gone from being a retired teacher to becoming a respected community leader. Schools across the city now invited her to speak about building bridges between law enforcement and residents. Her simple wisdom, see the person first, the situation second, had become a motto for the department's new approach. The young Rodriguez boy's videos had sparked a national conversation. His documentary about their neighborhood's transformation had won awards and inspired similar initiatives in other cities. Today, he was filming again, capturing the joy and unity that had replaced the tension of a year ago. Mrs. Chen stepped up to share news from the city council. Thanks to Mrs. Washington's experience, we've passed new guidelines for responding to neighborhood calls. Every complaint must now be verified before officers approach anyone's property. But more importantly, we've created regular forums where residents and police can talk openly about their concerns. The Thompson Girls' School program had expanded to every school in the district. Children now grew up seeing police officers as part of their community, not as distant authority figures. Today, several of her students were performing a play they'd written about building trust and understanding. Old Mr. Peterson, who'd seen decades of change in the neighborhood, wiped tears from his eyes as he watched the celebrations. "Never thought I'd see the day," he mumbled, his voice thick with emotion. "Never thought I'd see police and neighbors sharing meals together, planning together, working together like this." As evening approached, Mrs. Washington sat in her rocking chair, taking in the scene before her. Children played safely on the streets while officers chatted with residents over plates of home-cooked food. The fear and distrust that had once divided their community had been replaced by something stronger, understanding and respect. Her son joined her on the porch, handing her a plate of food. "You know, Mom," he said softly, "what happened that day was awful. But look what you helped create from it. Your strength, your dignity. It showed everyone how to turn a negative into a positive." Mrs. Washington smiled, watching as new neighbors were welcomed into the celebration. "Sometimes," she replied, "it takes a storm to clear the air. What matters is what you build after the storm passes." As the sun set on their celebration, casting a golden glow over the gathered community, Mrs. Washington felt a deep sense of peace. Her porch was more than just her sanctuary now. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible when people chose to stand together rather than stand apart. The streetlights flickered on, but nobody was ready to leave. Children continued playing, adults kept sharing stories, and somewhere in the background, someone started playing gentle music. This was more than just a celebration of what they'd overcome. It was a celebration of what they'd become. Mrs. Washington looked out at her transformed neighborhood and smiled. Sometimes the biggest changes started in the smallest places, even on an ordinary front porch on an ordinary street in an ordinary neighborhood. But there was nothing ordinary about the love, unity, and understanding that had grown there.